to this interview with Dr. Karen Pollard, who is a SACC member of the Carolinas. We are excited to get this opportunity to interview Karen. I am Dr. Stefan Ogenstad and I represent SACC Carolinas. My background is a PhD in statistics, having served for many years in the pharmaceutical industry. I'm also a faculty member and professor of biostatistics and the owner of Statogen, a biometrics consulting firm since 2006 down here in North Carolina. Karen, please tell us a little about your background and how you started this journey of neuropsychological assessments, the personalized tools, and one-on-one training.
Sure. So I am a neuropsychologist, which means I graduated with a doctorate in clinical psychology and then took a couple of extra years to specialize in neuropsychology. And I spent the first 10 years or so of my career in neuropsychology working in a clinical setting, which means that people came to me when they had issues with their thinking skills. Mostly people came to me because they were concerned about their memory. I would run them through a bunch of tests to check their thinking skills and then give them a diagnosis, tell them where to go from there. And what I found was that my favorite part of what I did was providing people with recommendations for how to use their strengths. So even people whose brains were seemingly failing, people entering Alzheimer's disease still had strengths. And I would talk to them about what they could do to work around their weaknesses by using their strengths. And I really enjoyed that part. Sadly, because most of my clients were developing neurodegenerative conditions, their brains weren't really capable of using the suggestions that I was giving them. So I started thinking, what if I gave these tests to healthy people who were capable of using that information to their advantage? Wouldn't that be a much greater impact on their life? So I approached my supervisors and a couple of times was told, no, insurance won't cover it, so no one will pay for it, so you can't do it. And after a while, I finally said, I disagree. I think people do care and people would pay for it. And so I started my own business, and that's how I got here.
Okay, very good, very good. And how long have you been in North Carolina?
I've been here for 8.5 years.
Okay, 8.5 years, very good. I believe that many of us would like better understand our strengths and weaknesses in a more quantitative way. If possible, can you tell us how you measure that?
Yes, so I use well-validated neuropsychological tests, and neuropsychological tests are all performance-based. So meaning it's not a questionnaire that asks you how you think you will perform in different situations. It's actually real-time performances. So somebody timing you while you do a task to check your performance speed, or someone asking you to remember a list of words or some information to see how much you retain. It's in real time. Tests of how your brain performs in certain skill areas. And all of the tests generate scores. The scores are then compared to normative groups based on your age, education, gender, race, all of those things to see in a standardized way where your brain performs best.
Okay, very good. So before we go into more detail, please describe the executive power process as you have mentioned it on your website and what the different performance scores are and how they are combined.
So I call it the executive power process. It's just the process that I use in my coaching practice where I first do a complete brain assessment on somebody. I generate what I call a Super 6 report, which tells me that person's super strengths in the 6 areas of thinking that are most relevant to business. It also helps me generate a personalized plan for that individual. And then thirdly, we do coaching to try to implement the plan. And the way that the scores are used is that I give 18 neuropsychological tests as part of my complete brain assessment, which generates 44 separate scores. And then there are interactions between the scores. And I just do a typical neuropsychological interpretation of those scores to look for the patterns to find the strengths.
So are these verbal questions to the person?
Some. Like I said, some are, they're timing them while they do something to check performance speed, but it's all interactive. None of it is sit at this computer and do this or answer this questionnaire and come back to me. It's all very interactive.
Okay. And there are no electrodes that you put on someone's head? Or?
No, we're not actually measuring brain waves or putting people in machines. It's all paper and pencil.
Okay, very good, very good. I understand that your test process is unique in the business world and has become a significant tool as a foundation for business coaching. How have the executives that have gone through this process responded?
You know, it's funny because a lot of people, when I approach them about this, think that it's going to be similar to a Myers-Briggs or a DISC assessment. And they think, you know, I've done all these before. And almost every single person who's done this, their first comment they make afterwards is, wow, I've never done anything like that before. So it's they're surprised, they're excited about the fact that they're getting actual objective information about their thinking, and it's not some, you know, like I said before, it's not a questionnaire that they're thinking that, well, if I'd answered this question differently, might I have gotten a different score? It's just very straightforward information that they've never had before about their brain and how it works.
Okay, very, very interesting. So please give us an example of the 6 areas you are identifying and how you arrive at the prominent super strength identification.
Yeah, so I'm going to draw a little bit, if that's okay.
Yes.
When I'm looking at this, we're looking at 6 areas of thinking and how they interact with one another. And again, I'm telling people there's super strengths in each area. So our brains are capable of doing, we can all do the same things, but we go about it very differently. And for some people, a certain activity takes more energy. And for other people, that same activity might take less mental energy. So my job is to find out what are the activities in each area of thinking that take the least amount of mental energy for a person. What does that person do the easiest? Because we want to focus there. So the first area might be problem solving. And we're looking at how does this person best approach problem solving? And then we're looking at attention. How do they focus best? We're looking at mental search. How does their brain go about finding information that they're looking for? We're looking at memory. How do they best remember information? We're looking at visual focus. Are they somebody that focuses on the detail, or are they somebody that focuses on the big picture? Because that can have implications for productivity and effectiveness. And we're also looking at performance speed. And if you notice, I only drew 5 circles because for each person in the 6 areas of thinking, there's going to be one that stands out as most prominent. That's the easiest thing for that person to do, the most obvious of their super strengths. And we put that in the middle, and it kind of makes like a little star area. We call that the superstar strength, but that's where the 6th one comes in. And it's the one that's most prominent for that person. So the way that we arrive at those conclusions is by looking at the patterns in the scores from the neuropsychological test. And as a neuropsychologist, that's what I'm trained to do, look for those patterns to see how brain energy is used.
Thank you. You mentioned that you work on their strength, not on their weaknesses. There are some people, I met them in the workplace, that are very, very bright and they are good at a lot of things, but some of them can be very obnoxious and people don't want to work with them because they are unpleasant to work with. So that's their weakness. Don't you think that that's important to address too?
So it's not as though we're ignoring areas of growth, but what we're saying is the way to overcome any obstacle that's preventing you from reaching your goals is the best way to do that is by relying on your strengths, not by trying to overcome or develop weaknesses. There's been a great deal of research that says you really want to put your energy in developing your strengths rather than developing weaknesses. You can still be trying to tackle obstacles, which is what I would say that you're describing. The person's way of interacting is an obstacle for them getting where they want to be because people don't want to work with them. But how do we tackle that? We don't try to develop what is already a weakness. We try to take something that is their strength and how do we use that to make improvements in the area that's giving them difficulty.
Okay, now I understand. Very good. So I was thinking, if a physician tells their patient that they will soon die if they don't immediately stop smoking, that it might be a strong enough trigger for the patient to stop smoking. The test results that you communicate to these executives is knowledge, but it might still not be an obvious trigger for change in that person's behavior. They might be all excited when you talk about all these things, but then they go back to their business and it falls behind them. It doesn't have an effect. How do you facilitate the person to want to make these necessary changes?
The most important thing in that process that you described is helping them go from an external motivation, meaning this test told me that this is my strength, so I should do things this way, or Dr. Karen says I should do things this way, to an intrinsic motivation. So if I can help coach someone for that first bit of time, and they're first doing it because I told them to do it, but then in the process of that, they're noticing, hey, at the end of the day, I have a lot more energy. I'm a lot less stressed. I've gotten a lot more done. When they can start making those connections, then the motivation becomes intrinsic and they want to do it more because they want to be less stressed and have more time and all of the other benefits that come from you relying on your strengths rather than, beating your head against a wall using your weaknesses.
Okay, very good. I remember I read some of the books by Richard Bandler and John Grinder. These were the founders of Neuro-Linguistic Programming, NLP. And they have shown that permanent changes can be made in persons where changes previously had not been possible. After you have communicated the test result, have you considered working with the executive, including NLP, to obtain permanent changes, even more than what you just described?
Yeah, I don't know a lot. I haven't done a lot of research about NLP specifically, but in what I have read about it, I feel like the process that I'm using is fairly similar in a lot of ways. It's about empowering people to take control of their neurological processes. I think the one thing that NLP does that I don't do as much is they focus a lot on copying. If you copy someone doing a behavior, you can program it in your brain. Not to say that I couldn't do that, but that hasn't been part of my practice so far. I've been much more focused on finding the strategies that would work for a certain person, having them do it, and then again, having them look at what benefit that gave them to keep doing it. Okay,
very, very good. You mentioned that all data and characteristics you measure are entirely objective. Have any of these tests been used as psychological or psychiatric rating scales within the mental health sector, or maybe even in the job interview process?
So none of these are surveys of any kind. From what I understand, what is out there in the business world right now, or in any kind of strictly psychological capacity, they're questionnaires. So they'll ask people to rate themselves in a certain way, or answer true or false, or say how strongly they agree with different things. It's very subjective. And as a user of those, I've often thought, well, I'm not sure about this answer, I'll go with this one. And then at the end, when I get my results, I think, well, that kind of sounds like me. But then I read the box next to mine and I think, well, that one could be me too. What if I'd answered that question differently? And I have all these thoughts about the subjective nature of the questionnaires. In the neuropsych world, nothing is subjective. We're only doing objective measures of your thinking skills. Now, I typically screen for depression and anxiety, and those scales have been used obviously in clinical settings or other places. And the reason I do that is because sometimes people aren't aware that they're feeling depressed or anxious, and that can certainly impact their efficiency and effectiveness at work. So we want to address that if it's there. But as far as the neuropsych tests, no, none of them would have been used before in a job setting or in a psychological setting.
Is there a concordance between this battery of tests that you are using? If you would redo it, or someone else would use this? Because I remember the brief psychiatric rating scale for psychosis They had 18 of the most famous Canadian psychiatrists, and they rated a patient that was schizophrenic, but they would see individually this patient on a video, and their ratings were not very much in line. So there was a poor concordance, although these were the best in the field. Do you have any idea of your concordance between your battery of measurement?
So the battery I'm using is the battery I used to use in a clinical setting. I took a couple things out that aren't relevant here, like I'm not giving a mental status exam because everybody that I'm working with has pretty intact mental status for the most part. But it's the exact battery that a neuropsychologist would use if you went in and had you say I got in a car accident tomorrow and I hit my head and I had to go have a battery of tests done. It's probably the same exact test that would be done there. So there should be very high correspondence between what I would rate and what another neuropsychologist would rate, or if you had to have a follow-up test. The only thing is when I'm giving people the data, I'm not giving them all their scores because it's very technical, and I found it was very confusing for a lot of people when I used to do that. So I'm really only giving them their Super 6 and talking about what the implications of that are. So they couldn't, necessarily take this to another neuropsychologist and say, has anything changed based on that report?
Okay, I understand. And I was thinking also about school children and students. Would they benefit from your process?
I think so, particularly as people get into high school and the kids are starting to learn their what study strategies work best for them and that sort of thing. Right now, the tests that I use are all normed for adults, so 18 and over. So I cannot right now see anyone under 18, but I hope that that becomes part of my practice in the future. I hope to hire a pediatric neuropsychologist who could develop something very similar that could be used with children.
Okay, very good. So what are the future steps for you, or have you reached the final battery of tools you are using, or are you thinking of extensions or modifications?
I'm sure I'll always be thinking of if I've got the best possible measures to tap into these 6 areas of thinking. I don't have any that I'm considering swapping out right now, but I will always be watching the literature for something that might be better than what I'm currently using.
Okay, very good. I firmly believe that the work you do and the tools or instruments you're using for many business people today are critical, particularly for executives, because they lead other people. But I believe for anyone actually, are there any last words you would like to say before our time is up?
I just really appreciate the opportunity to do this interview and explain this new way that people can understand themselves or the teams that they work with. It can be really valuable to understand how somebody on your team thinks that may be similar or different, or uses their brain energy that may be similar or different from how you do. So thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to explain it and for making this video. I just thank you so much.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. So thank you for your insights on this fascinating subject, and in particular during this pandemic and turbulent period. We hope that we can follow up with a meeting soon. I hope you all SACC Carolinas members and enjoy Dr. Karen Pollard's presentation, and we will do more of these kinds of interviews during this year. Bye for now, SACC Carolinas. Thank you, everyone.